Ever just have one of those days where you're completely drained and all you want is to totally veg out? Maybe it's I don't know, diving into a huge bowl of ice cream or just disappearing down an internet rabbit hole for an hour. We all have those things, right? Our own little ways of coping with, well, life. But what if those comfort seeking moments were actually connected to something much deeper, something like trauma, even? Today, we're really diving deep into the hidden links between trauma and addiction. And I gotta tell you, they're way more intertwined than most people think. And to guide us through this, we have the amazing Maia Szalavitz. Now, she's not just an author writing about addiction, she's been there, lived it, and come out stronger on the other side. Her book, Undoing Drugs, was a serious eye opener for me. Did you know over 40% of people struggling with opioid addiction have actually gone through childhood abuse or neglect? That number, it kind of blew my mind. It really makes you stop and think, what really pushes someone towards drugs in the first place?
It's such an important question. And to really get it, we have to kind of reframe how we think about trauma itself. It's not always this big, dramatic, singular event. Trauma can be much more, I guess you could say, insidious. Think about constant bullying or even just growing up with a parent who's battling depression. These experiences, they might seem almost common, but they can leave a lasting impact on the brain.
So it's not just the big, scary stuff, but also these smaller, long-term stressors that kind of seep in over time.
Precisely. You see, both trauma and addiction, they actually end up rewiring the brain's reward and stress systems. Think about dopamine, like your brain's own little reward system, right? Gives you a high five every time you do something pleasurable. Then you've got the brain's opioid system, which is all about helping us avoid pain. But then trauma comes along and kind of throws a wrench in the whole system.
So the brain's kind of stuck on this constant loop of stress from the trauma, and it starts looking for relief wherever it can, even if it's just temporary.
Exactly. And substances, they offer that shortcut to a dopamine rush, that feeling of escape, even if it's just for a little while.
It's like, imagine your brain is this house alarm that's always going off, right? And if you grew up in a chaotic or unpredictable environment, that alarm, it never really shuts off. Your system's always primed for danger. And then you find something, maybe it's alcohol, maybe drugs, whatever, and it silences that alarm, even for a bit. It's no wonder that substance starts to feel less like a choice and more like a lifeline. Reading about Maia Szalavitz's own story really drove this point home for her. Her father was a Holocaust survivor. Just think about the horrors he endured as a child and the impact that must have had on his mental health, on the entire environment she grew up in.
Absolutely. Early trauma like that can create this heightened sensitivity to threat. It's almost like your brain is still wired for survival from those early stressors. So even neutral situations get interpreted as potentially dangerous. You're constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that can lead to impulsivity, difficulty managing emotions, all fertile ground for addiction to take root.
It's like walking on eggshells all the time, even when there's really no reason to.
Exactly. And then there's anhedonia. You've ever heard of that? It's the inability to actually experience pleasure, which is often a symptom of depression. Imagine going through life feeling numb, disconnected. It's tough, you know? It really makes substances seem even more tempting because they offer any kind of break from that empty feeling.
Like grasping at anything that makes you feel something, even if it's just a quick escape from feeling numb.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just, well, it's kind of disheartening that this whole moral failing view of addiction is still so common. Even with all we know now about the brain, about trauma, there's still this tendency to blame people for their addictions. Like blaming someone with a broken leg for, limping.
Yeah, it seems so counterproductive, like just piling on shame and guilt on top of everything else someone struggling with addiction is already dealing with.
Exactly. It makes recovery so much harder. But thankfully, there's a real shift happening toward trauma-informed care. Therapies like COPE, which stands for Concurrent Treatment of PTSD and Substance Use Disorders, using prolonged exposure, are showing a lot of promise.
Cope, yeah. I remember reading about that and thinking, wow, that sounds intense, but in a good way. How does it actually work?
Well, remember how we talked about avoidance being a big part of trauma? COPE helps people process those traumatic memories, but in a safe, controlled environment. It's about slowly confronting those avoided situations and emotions, but in a way that actually starts to rewire the brain's fear response.
So like rewiring your brain's response to fear, kind of like swapping out the faulty wiring that kept setting off all those false alarms. It's not just toughing it out, it's changing how your brain reacts to those triggers.
Exactly. And Maia Szalavitz actually shares a really powerful story about a veteran named Michael who struggled with PTSD and alcohol addiction after serving in Afghanistan. He went through COPE therapy, and it really made a difference for him.
I think I remember that story. Didn't cope help him process a lot of the anger he'd been trying to numb with alcohol?
Yes. And it wasn't just about quitting drinking for him. It was about confronting that underlying pain that was driving those behaviors in the first place. That's what's so crucial about this approach. Addressing the root cause, the trauma, can actually lessen how strong the grip of addiction is. It's not about willpower, it's about healing.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. It's like we all have those coping mechanisms, right? But sometimes those mechanisms, they become part of the problem
That's
themselves.
a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And there's another approach that Szalavitz talks about, cognitive processing therapy, or CPT. It's particularly helpful for people who might not be ready to directly confront their trauma memories just yet.
Okay, so how does CPT work? What's the difference there?
Well, instead of zeroing in on the actual traumatic event itself, CPT helps people challenge those negative core beliefs that often come from trauma. Those thoughts like, I'm not good enough, or it's all my fault.
Right, those really deep-seated, self-sabotaging thoughts that can keep us so stuck.
Exactly. And those beliefs can be a huge driving force behind addiction. Solovitz talks about a woman named Sandra who used alcohol and ketamine to cope with anxiety that stemmed from childhood trauma.
After a particularly bad experience with an abusive boyfriend, she turned to CPT.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm already seeing how these therapies could be so life-changing for people.
Yeah, it was incredible to read about, actually. CPT helped her really pinpoint and challenge those deep-seated negative beliefs that were just fueling her addiction. Beliefs like, I'll never be safe, or I'm not worthy of love. Challenging those, that's a huge step towards breaking free.
Wow, that's really powerful, like rewiring those thought patterns, replacing self-destruction with self-compassion.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of neuroplasticity comes in.
Neuroplasticity,
Yeah.
right? The brain's ability to change and adapt throughout our lives. That's it. It's a game changer for both PTSD and addiction recovery because it means we're not stuck with the brain we're born with or the one that's, been shaped by trauma. We can actually rewire those neural pathways, create healthier patterns, healthier responses. It's really pretty hopeful.
That's what gets me excited about the potential for psychedelics and treatment like MDMA. The research is still new, but some studies are suggesting that they can actually boost neuroplasticity and make social connections stronger. Both those are so important for recovery. It's like hitting the reset button on the brain, in a way, to create a space for really deep healing.
It is fascinating stuff, isn't it? But while those early findings seem promising, we have to remember psychedelics aren't a magic solution. They can be really powerful tools, but they have to be used responsibly with therapy and in a safe and supportive environment.
Definitely not something to try at home.
Exactly. But I think just the
Yeah.
fact that we're even looking at these possibilities says something about how we're approaching trauma and addiction now. It's less about shame and blame and more about understanding, compassion, and I think most importantly, hope.
That's a powerful note to end on. We've covered so much in this deep dive, but the takeaway is pretty clear. Trauma and addiction, they're deeply connected. And understanding that connection is the key to better treatment, better recovery, and just a more compassionate way of looking at these issues. So as you go about your day, maybe think about how trauma might be playing a role, even in a hidden way, in your own life or in the lives of people around you. Maybe it's time for all of us to just offer a little more understanding, a little more empathy, and a lot less judgment.